Attention, the story you are about to hear is not suitable for sensitive individuals or minors. It also does not intend to promote delicate practices, and its truthfulness may or may not be real. Therefore, discretion is advised. I took down a hitman. I can't tell you my name or where I'm from because my safety would be at risk. What I can tell you is that I was born in Michoacan, the cradle of drug trafficking in Mexico and a nest from which ruthless hitmen emerge. My childhood was characterized by fear. We often heard gunfire or armed commands crossing the town with the intent of reaching the areas where the drug lords were based or carrying out their misdeeds. The only good memory I have from that time is my friendship with Nacho, a boy my age with whom I got along very well and who liked soccer as much as I did. We attended the same elementary school and continued through secondary school together. Our friendship grew to the point where we joined the school soccer team and planned to continue our athletic training in high school. Unfortunately, things didn't go as we had hoped because, during a police raid, a group of drug traffickers turned the city upside down. When COM returned, they reported that several people had lost their lives in the crossfire, including Nacho's father. My dear friend barely made it through secondary school and moved with his mother to where his grandparents lived, a simple town over 2 hours away, which meant we could no longer see each other. We tried to remain friends from a distance, calling each other occasionally, but it didn't work out. Despite the nearby incidents, the area where I lived remained afloat, so I looked ahead, enrolled in high school, and tried to continue studying to become a soccer player, something I couldn't achieve because a rule was established for students to leave classes and go straight home. I used the time to study, which allowed me to get into university. 7 years later, I graduated as a doctor. I was delayed by a year due to various issues, but my family was happy for me, and I felt satisfied. I spent some time working at a well-known pharmacy's clinic to gain experience and save a little money. Then I rented a central location and started offering private consultations. I had countless patients in that space, some of whom became regular visitors due to their ongoing ailments. Very soon, I considered the clinic my second home, and as is common, it's at home where sometimes the most terrifying things happen. It happened one afternoon in June. I was finishing my workday when several police trucks with sirens blaring drove down the avenue. At the end was a patrol car with the loudspeaker on, and the officers inside were asking the population to shelter for a few hours. I didn't think I'd have time to get home, so I lowered the shop's metal shutter and stayed in the reception area. The sound of gunfire didn't take long to begin, so I moved to the back of the clinic and curled up behind the desk, which fortunately was made of metal and thick enough to give me confidence. The confrontations went on for too long. At times, it seemed like the shooting had stopped, but then another burst would start a few minutes later. I couldn't fathom where so many weapons and ammunition were coming from when everyone everywhere was complaining about the economic crisis. Anyway, around 9 p.m., calm settled over the area, and my soul, along with many other citizens who were sheltering in their businesses or homes, found peace in the thought that we were no longer at risk. I came out of the room and peeked into the waiting area, staying alert to detect any signs of danger outside. I heard nothing more, so I gathered my things, put on my jacket, and prepared to leave. Standing in front of the door, a loud bang on the metal shutter froze me in place. I could see the shadow of a person beneath it, and his voice also slipped through. He was moaning as if he were hurt. A moment later, I confirmed it was a man because he started calling out, "Doctor, are you still there?" My vocation kicked in at that moment. I said yes, opened the glass door, raised the heavy shutter, and came face to face with a gun. I didn't know what to do. I just stood still with my hands up. The man entered my clinic, moving clumsily, and ordered me to close the door. Once inside, he pointed the gun barrel at his hip. He had been shot, and his clothes were soaked with blood. He ordered me to treat him. Although the first thing that came to mind was to refuse, I realized that doing what he ordered gave me a better chance of surviving. I took out the necessary instruments from my bag and began to examine him. The bullet had only grazed him, but that was enough to leave a significant wound that would incapacitate him for a few days and heal in about 3 weeks. I disinfected the area and covered it with sterilized gauze. Then I stood still, waiting for what would come next, my death or my release. During those minutes, my mind processed thousands of thoughts, but one of them caught my attention. That man reminded me of someone. I searched through my memories until a name came to my lips. Nacho? Is that you? The man jumped up like a spring and pushed me against the wall. The barrel of his gun chilled my forehead as he shouted insults and demanded to know why I recognized him. I quickly told him my name, and his furious face softened. Before my eyes, the criminal crumbled and transformed into the boy I used to play with for hours, the one who dreamed of winning a trophy to buy a truck for his parents. First of all, he apologized to me. Then he stood there, lost in thought for a while, staring into nothingness and wiping away the tears streaming from his eyes. After a few minutes, he turned and asked me to tell him how I had been. I told him what you already know, that I continued studying and gave up soccer to become a doctor. At the end of my story, I asked the most common question, "And you?" Nacho told me that when his mother took him to his grandparents' village, he tried to keep studying, but without his father, things got tough, and he ended up working in the fields with other laborers to earn some money to get by. Before he had even spent a year working in the fields, men arrived in the village who started intimidating the workers until they controlled every corner of the town. Gradually, the once peaceful farming community turned into a hell where it seemed like nothing worse could happen, but it did. They began taking the young men, and although Nacho tried to avoid being recruited, one night they broke into his house and dragged him out. Those were gray days when my dear friend witnessed and endured so much violence that, as he described it, his eyes darkened as if he were reliving every image and sensation from that time. When the spirits of each young man were broken, they were told that joining the group would end their torment. Many immediately agreed. Those who didn't decide right away did so later when they were told that if they didn't cooperate willingly, their families would end up hanging from a tree. Among the latter, my friend ended up taking the tools of the trade and following the orders of unscrupulous people. The first tasks were simple, like watching a house or following someone in neighboring cities. But one day his superior coldly said to him, "Yesterday, your mother and grandparents disappeared. We caught the culprit. What do you want to do? Should we forgive him or teach him a lesson?" Nacho couldn't process the man's words, so he helped by showing him recent photos of a destroyed house and the bodies of 2 elderly people alongside a middle-aged woman. Without a doubt, it was his family. With those images in front of him, a shattered heart, and immense rage, he took the weapon from his boss and pulled the trigger until the ammunition ran out. There was no turning back. They no longer asked him to spy on the gang's rivals, but to erase them from the map. Nacho didn't question why he had to do it. He just emptied the magazine on whoever they told him to, and that was that. As he recounted this, at some point, I noticed that my old friend was trembling. He stared at his hands as if he could still see the fresh blood of the people he had killed, and he fell silent for a moment. Then he turned to look at me and said, "I don't know how many people I've wiped out. I lost count a long time ago. It's been over 10 years. After that, I heard about some of the things he had done, which were nothing like the cheerful boy I remembered. On one occasion, he was ordered to take out the family of a shopkeeper who refused to pay the required fees. He arrived at the house during a gathering. He called his boss to ask if he could wait for the guests to leave, but he was told no, so he killed a dozen people, including the shopkeeper's wife, his parents, 3 of his siblings, and his 2 children with their respective partners. In the heat of the attack, he felt powerful and full of energy, considering himself a god with the power to decide who lived and who didn't. However, later, he reflected on the situation. The shopkeeper was left alone, just like him. Weeks later, They found out that the man couldn't bear the situation and was found hanging in a hotel room. The criminals removed him from their payment lists and hours later added the names of other people, other shopkeepers whose fate would turn dark the next day. Many times, he had to do things like that, break into different homes and unleash his weapons on those inside. He also snuffed out the breath of sleeping citizens with their own pillows, yet, among all those deeds, 2 incidents still sent shivers down his spine and gripped his mind with a remorse from which he could not escape. He was ordered to enter a house and do the job. It was a small apartment, and he blew the lock off with a single shot. That day, they gave him a silencer, so the impact alerted only the tenants. He entered the apartment with his weapon ready, but was met face to face with a pregnant young woman. His hand froze. He stared at the girl, saw the terror in her eyes, and noticed how her fingers rubbed her belly as if they were thick enough to protect the life inside. Nacho dared to ask if there was anyone else, and the woman shook her head to say no. Her lips trembled with fear, but she couldn't find the words to plead for her life, though her mind must have been screaming them inside. The hitman asked again, "Do you have problems with anyone? Is your husband involved in something dangerous?" The young woman shook her head again, murmuring, "I don't know," and desperately clutched her stomach. "No," the hitman whispered, "this girl wasn't guilty of anything. She was just the target of someone's revenge." The thought of letting her go crossed his mind, telling her to pack a bag and leave, but he knew his people would hunt her down to the ends of the earth. Nacho's mind raced, and he concluded there was no alternative, so he raised his weapon, aimed at the stranger's forehead, and pulled the trigger. That was the only thing he could do for her, give her a quick and painless end. Her body fell backward, and he watched it collapse as if it were an angel. One hand remained on her swollen belly, reminding him of his own mother. That day, he wished to leave the business, but the problem was that his line of work had only one exit: death. He avoided his boss's calls, consumed some substances, and drank until he lost consciousness. Whenever the substances dulled his senses, his thoughts filled with screams, and everything turned red. The melodious voice of his mother begged him to stop hurting others, but he couldn't find her no matter how hard he searched. His journey could have ended there, with an overdose or an alcohol-induced coma. Instead, he woke up in a hospital, and his boss gave him a few days to recover so he could resume his work, which was already piling up. Nacho was valued for his innate ability to follow orders. They liked that he didn't ask questions and had no one for the enemy to use as leverage. Of course, if one day he broke, he would be replaced by another man or woman, someone broken enough to pull the trigger without hesitation. As time passed, the memory of the pregnant woman was buried under other terrified faces, drowned out by the screams of other women and the cries of different debtors. Then fate gave him another harsh reminder. The job was simple: eliminate the owner of a restaurant who had handed over tapes to the police that revealed the faces of important gang members, which was unacceptable. Nacho visited the establishment, wearing branded clothes and different wigs each time. His goal was to locate the cameras and plan a hit that would make it clear why there was a price on the owner's head, but without leaving any trace that could link the crime to his people. In fact, he was supposed to plant some white powder to divert attention. His steps were methodical, and one afternoon, when there were few diners, he asked to greet the owner, claiming they were friends. A waitress told him he could go upstairs, where the owner would see him. The hitman followed the instructions, knowing he didn't need to be cautious upstairs because there was no recording system. He took out his weapon, attached the silencer, and knocked on a wooden door. As soon as it opened, he fired. The bullet left the gun and headed for the restaurant owner, but unfortunately, the man was holding a baby. My old friend saw the restaurant owner's eyes widen in shock, heard the guttural scream that erupted from his throat, and the wails of a woman running toward the door. Nacho never imagined that the businessman would be with his grandchild and daughter. His exact words were, "I didn't think about anything, but my hand lifted, and my finger squeezed the trigger so a bullet could hit the target's face. Then my arm moved, and a second bullet drew a perfect circle under the mother's eye." Both adults fell, and a crimson pool began to form under their silhouettes. The baby, meanwhile, cried strangely, like a fish gasping for air out of water. The child lay on the floor, still in his grandfather's arms, his tiny hands moving in search of help that would never come. The hitman bent down to pick him up and noticed that the red stain on the baby's clothes wasn't from the man's blood, but was seeping from the child's own body. The first bullet had lodged in the tiny torso. Nacho began to cry as he told me it was a boy and that no matter how much he begged the child to hold on, he went stiff in his hands and then went limp. Sometimes I wonder what happened to him, whether God took him to paradise or sent him to hell for dying in the arms of a monster, the criminal whispered, with an indescribable melancholy. Throughout the entire story, I felt nauseated by the person sitting in front of me. It quickly became clear that this was no longer my friend. He had died long ago, and what I was now looking at was a shell of the man he was supposed to be, animated by a vile force. A repugnant and despicable being whose death would be a miracle for the whole world. I, being a doctor who saved lives, wished that Nacho would leave this world as soon as possible. But then, I feared he might sense my wish and take revenge on me or my family. I kept my gaze down, and when he asked me what I thought, I didn't respond. "I know what you're thinking," he said after a while. "It's the same thing I think, that I'm disgusting, that I'm scum, that I don't deserve to be here, and that society would be better off if I were filled with lead." I looked at him in silence, confirming with my eyes what he already knew. He then stood up and headed for the door, and I felt an immense sense of relief, thinking he was leaving. But suddenly, he turned around and aimed at my face. My heart raced, and my fear intensified when he spoke. "Maybe I found you for a reason. That's enough. I can't change, but I can make one good decision before adding worse sins to my wretched existence." I went into shock when he came back to stand in front of me and placed his weapon in my hand. He gave me the most terrifying instructions I've ever heard. "You're going to raise it, make sure the muzzle is level with my eyebrows, and pull the trigger." That unknown man who was once my best friend in childhood and who life burdened with such a terrible load was beyond salvation. He was raving, driven mad by the lives he had trampled on, lives as helpless as his own. Seeing me hesitate, he resorted to insults I'd only heard on television and never imagined hearing in real life. He began pacing in circles, limping because of the bullet in his hip. The movement caused him pain, and he pulled down his pants to tear out the stitches I had put in a couple of hours earlier. In my office, there was no man. What stood before me was a deranged demon, one who would cause even more sorrow and pain than he had in the past if he left. I raised his weapon, and Nacho stopped. His eyes were full of tears. "Will they forgive me up there?" he asked, his voice softening. "I don't think so, right? I don't deserve it." I didn't believe he deserved forgiveness either because, in my view, he always had the opportunity to change, to find another path, or, in extreme cases, accept death instead of dealing it. I pulled the trigger slightly, and the sound it made chilled my blood. The hitman's face relaxed as if he had just been administered a life-saving drug, and he looked at me with a different expression. "I'm going to give you 2 orders before you do it," he told me. "I have an apartment downtown on San Miguel Street, number 5. Tell the landlady you're from Moreno, and she'll give you the key, no problem. Under the bed, there's some money, not much, but it'll help your family. Don't worry, no one knows about that place, you'll be fine. After you're done with me, take me to a ravine where no one, not my people or the police, will ever find me." I wanted to believe something was happening at that moment, that Nacho had a chance, and that I could give it to him. I quickly imagined that together we could correct his mistakes, and I began to lower the weapon. Automatically, the hitman read my actions and smiled horribly, like a vile devil, licking his lips before confessing, "Not only have I killed, but in the business, we also know how to extract the truth. We cut more than nails, even out ears, and slowly crush feet. Some people we carve up alive, even after they've told us what we need to know. I've never done it, but I've watched my comrades cut girls up like puzzles. They're good at cutting off cups and sharing. They take turns, maybe they'd still get some use out of your MO. The obscene words hung in the air. My hand acted on its own. Nacho coughed, and several threads of blood flowed from his mouth. He fell to his knees, clutching his stomach, and then looked at his reddened palms. The idea of hurting someone was unacceptable to me, and I made a move to help him, but the hitman refused. It would have been better in the head, but I deserved this pain. The red liquid kept flowing, and I became aware that Nacho's damaged organs were causing his system to collapse, and the external and internal bleeding would soon end his life. Within a few minutes, he could no longer stay upright, and he slumped forward. As he felt his strength fading, he whispered a word that remains etched in my memory: "Thank you." The man died at 11:49 p.m. outside. There were no more sounds of police sirens or trucks speeding by. The silence seemed to honor his sacrifice, but I paid no attention to it. I experienced a panic attack. I wondered what would happen if someone suddenly lifted the curtain, if they found me with the remains in the office and a weapon in my right hand. I felt fear, remorse, and disgust. You never know what you'll do in desperate situations until you have to face them. Nacho asked me for help, and it was selfish because he placed a burden on my shoulders that I will never be able to shake off. Anyway, I tried to calm myself and think. In my office, I had some large canvas bags that I used for garbage, as the daily waste was biological in nature. I grabbed one of them and confirmed that I could fit the body inside. I just had to position it in a fetal pose. I put on some gloves and began to maneuver. Since the death was recent, it wasn't difficult to handle Nacho. My car was in the parking lot, and I could use the wheeled support table to move the bag. The clock already showed 2 o'clock in the morning when I left my office, but first, I had to clean up all the red liquid from the reception area. I walked down the street with immense fear of being discovered. When I reached my vehicle, my hand struggled to open the trunk. I dropped the keys a couple of times, and then I had a hard time fitting the bag inside. As if by divine intervention, I didn't encounter anyone. Perhaps people were still scared in their homes after the horrific afternoon we had. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove slowly to avoid attracting attention. I headed to the highway and took a secondary road, which veered toward the neighboring state and passed by several cliffs whose bottoms were hidden by countless trees. I drove for 2 hours, and when I finally found the place I was heading to, I pulled over and turned off the lights. I could see the road both ahead and behind me. My heart was racing, but luck was on my side because there were no other drivers in sight. I got out of the car, opened the trunk, took out the bag, and dragged it to the edge of the road. I couldn't see anything but a black abyss. As a farewell, I hurled a few insults at Nacho and gave the bag a kick. I heard the sound of branches being hit and also detected the dislodging of some rocks. A dull thud indicated that the bag had reached the bottom, so I ran back to my car, turned around, and drove back home as fast as I could. I arrived home at dawn and found my mother in the living room, waiting for me with a blanket over her shoulders. She hugged me, shedding a few tears of relief, and I cried in her lap. She probably thought I had been scared by what happened, and I didn't correct her. It's been over 5 years, and I never heard of anyone looking for the man who died in my office. No police came asking about him, nor were there any strange people lurking around. I didn't have to explain the money I deposited in my bank account or the renovations I made to my parents' house. Of course, I went through days full of tension and nights plagued with nightmares. However, when the moment arrived, calm returned, and I realized one thing: I killed the hitman, yes, but it was because he asked me to, and I believe it gave him the peace he desperately needed. Even today, I have anxiety episodes where I relive the death of my old friend over and over again. Guilt overwhelms me, and I've even considered turning myself into the police, but then I think, why would I do that? Nacho was an incredible friend during my childhood, but later on, he became an irrational beast. Therefore, he doesn't deserve anyone's tears or suffering, least of all mine. Yes, I was involved in his horrific death, but I have also managed to heal thousands of babies, children, adults, and the elderly. Sometimes I remember things as if they were a dream. Sometimes it seems like I imagined it all. Nevertheless, I keep the weapon Nacho gave me in the safe in my room, the same one I fired that night when crime turned the city upside down. I clean it from time to time to remind myself that I'm still here and he's never coming back. Friends, thank you very much for joining me during tonight's stories. Don't forget to subscribe and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of the horror stories we have for you. Write in the comments where you're listening from so I can give you a shout out in the next stories. See you in the next episode of Dark Secret.